I want to begin Module 3 by giving you a brief overview of the ministry of Paul. I think it's helpful to understand sort of a timeline, a basic chronology of when things occurred as we read his letters and then find sort of correlations in the book of Acts. I would encourage you to get out a map, maybe even kind of consider looking at sort of the different places, the cities where Paul would have gone, familiarizing yourself with some of the geography, even the geographic terms. For instance, Philippi and Thessalonica are located in Macedonia. Understanding kind of the provinces and what the names were, it gives you a better idea of where Paul was going and the distances and that sort of thing. What we do know from reading Acts and from reading Paul's own writings is that he was converted in Damascus after having seen Jesus on the road, and Ananias came, baptizes him, and Paul begins preaching immediately and was thrown out of the city and goes into Arabia for a time, and then returns to Damascus, and then goes down to visit Jerusalem for the first time. Now, that first Jerusalem visit probably occurred around 37 AD, and his conversion would have likely been around 34 AD. Paul continues a ministry after visiting Jerusalem, goes home to Tarsus, and then is found by Barnabas and takes him to Antioch, where they have a ministry there, and that would have gone up until about 45 AD. At which time we know that Paul visits Jerusalem again, this time with Barnabas bringing some money for famine relief from some of the churches for the church there in Jerusalem. And so that would have occurred, not quite sure, 45, 46, 47 AD, around that time frame. Then Paul leaves on his first missionary journey. Now, his first journey took him to places such as Cyprus. Then he went to Perga, then to Antioch, to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, which are Galatian churches. So when you think about the letter to the Galatians, it was written to those churches that he planted during his first missionary journey. And in fact, it's during that journey he writes back to the Galatians, most likely in about 48 AD. So when you read that, Galatians was probably one of Paul's first letters. And he was very concerned, having just planted that church. Obviously, the Judaizers were getting in there. And during Paul's first missionary journey, it seemed like he was getting kicked out of every city because of trouble stirred up by the synagogues. He returns from that first journey, and he returns to Jerusalem and to the Jerusalem Council, which would have occurred most likely in 48 or 49 AD. The apostles convene to decide what to do about all these new Gentile converts and whether or not they should be required to be circumcised. Then Paul leaves on his second missionary journey, which was pretty epic. It's probably the largest of his journey. It seems like he goes with Silas this time because, remember, John Mark had left them the first time around, so he and Barnabas split ways. Paul grabs Silas and he goes back to visit some of the churches again in Galatia and other places where he had already previously started planted churches. And then a funny thing happens is that he gets to Troas, and has this vision to go to Macedonia, and so he leaves Asia Minor and he crosses the channel into Europe and goes over to Macedonia, where he plants churches in places like Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, and makes his way down the coast, also making as far as Athens and Corinth. And then after that, you might remember he has his hair cut off as a vow in Centuria, and he sails over to Ephesus, where he spends some time, and then he returns back to Judea. So during that second missionary journey, it's likely that he wrote back to the Thessalonians after planting that church in 50 to 51 AD. And so those would be the only letters written during that time. His third missionary journey is basically a repeat, just different routes to some of the same places where he had already been. And it's during that third missionary journey that he would have written a letter to the Corinthians, and he wrote his letter to the Romans. When Paul returns from the third journey, he goes to Jerusalem and is finally arrested and sent to Caesarea for trial. He appeals to Caesar, but while he's in Caesarea for a couple of years, and during that time writes the letter to the Philippians. After getting to Rome, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. Most scholars believe that Paul was only imprisoned in Rome for a few years and actually was released. We don't know what happened there because Acts ends with his Roman imprisonment, but it seems likely that he was released for a time. He had a ministry for a while in other places that he wanted to go, and he, during that time, would have written both Timothy's as well as Titus, and then was again arrested in Rome and executed under Nero between 64 and 65 AD. All these dates are, some of them are pretty tight, and others are very loose based on evidence in the letters and things that we can kind of pinpoint from things that are mentioned in the letters or mentioned in Acts that help us to identify a point in time in history, and allows us to kind of anchor some of these the distances and times and whatnot that were happening with the writing of the letters. So this just kind of gives you a broad overview. I hope that helps, even as you think about these letters that were written by Paul, when they were written, to whom they were written. I would encourage you to make sure you have a good commentary or something that goes back and tells you, kind of helps you understand the situation as best you can. I think it will give a lot of insight into your study, into your word, into your teaching as well. All right.